So hello friends and welcome. It's story time, kind of, because I'm going to talk about how my ordination process came about. I'll try not to go into the stories though. I think some stories associated with that will make entire talks of their own for days and nights to come. For instance, how did I get here? How did I get to India in the middle of a pandemic when you couldn't even go to the local shops? I was able to fly to another country and then travel and do things. That is for another talk entirely, okay? So we'll put that one aside for now, and I'll begin with 3 years ago, a bit over 3 years ago, in the summer of 2020. I was living on a beach on the south coast of England, alone, obviously. I suppose not obviously, but I'll explain that in a minute. But not in a camper van, in a very old Ford Transit box van, which I'd acquired very cheaply, part exchanging one of my last things that I owned, having given everything away previously over months and years. I just had this old Skoda motor car, cheapest car I could use to run around in whilst I was in England and not visiting Thailand. I part exchanged this for this old van which I lived in, and it was about a little bit smaller than this cootie inside, a little bit narrower, but about similar length. And if you look at previous videos on here of that van, you'll see it's very similar in nature to a monk's cootie. I lined it with wood and insulation because it's cold there in the winter in England. And I had been living in that van, this time 3 years ago, in the summer of 2020. I had been living in that van for 3 years in the same spot. In fact, the grass had grown around this spot. I didn't travel in the van. It barely passed its tests to be legally allowed on the road. It was very rusty, having been on the beach for these 3 years, and in the winter getting covered in seawater regularly. And I had no desire or need to travel anywhere. I was in a secluded spot at that time. It was a very peaceful and enjoyable place to live. And I'd gone there one night to test this van out, and thought I'd spend the night here, look at the stars and meditate. And 3 years later I was still there, albeit with the odd trip to Thailand. And in 2020, because of the pandemic, I was waiting to get to India for my ordination. And I got to India for my ordination and took my Samanera ordination, Pabaja, as I was explaining in the previous talk. Having already been an Anagarika, I ordained there actually as an Anagarika for a few months, and then took Pabaja ordination quite quickly, because they came to know me very quickly, not only through living there with them in this monastery in India. This was the Mahabodhi Society of Bangalore, whom have branches throughout India, and of course also in Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha became enlightened, the Mecca, the holy site of Buddhism. And that is where I took my Bhikkhu ordination eventually, but I'll come to that. So initially I went to the branch in Bangalore, but previous to this, 3 years living, practicing meditation, I was not a monk at that stage. So 3 years ago, or a bit longer than that, a bit over 3 years ago, I was not a monk. But I had been living as a monk at least on the 8 precepts anyway. So not eating in the afternoon, no entertainment, no celibacy, so I'd taken up celibacy, no sexual activity, and obviously no intoxicants. I'd taken this up in 2015 when I first came to Thailand and visited and stayed at a monastery not far from here, in this part of eastern Thailand. So that would be, so yes, so at that stage I had been on the 8 precepts, living as a monk, either in the monastery in Thailand or in my van in England. Actually there's a couple of years when I still had my flat in England, but as I gradually reduced all the contents, well, quite quickly actually, there wasn't much in the first place, but I got rid of everything in the flat and was sleeping on the floor and living on the 8 precepts. And then I got rid of the flat and the car and got this van and lived in the van for 3 years. But it all started with meditation, as it often does with people from the western part of the world. I started meditating in 2012. And in 2012 I knew nothing about Buddhism, knew nothing about meditation, and so what's that now? That's 11 years or so ago, 12 years ago getting on, and took up a podcast or something like this, and I had seen my son, my eldest son, he was practicing meditation. I'd heard about this and thought, well, you know, no harm, I'll give it a go. And took to it quite quickly, enjoyed it, found it was beneficial and really helped me start to calm my mind and become more settled than I was feeling at the time. I had given up a lot of things. I'd become single previously. A few years prior to that I'd become divorced. I was single. I decided I'd give up intoxicants or drinking, but I was still socializing and having a fairly ordinary life. But I'd given up the hectic work schedule that I'd previously had and just had a routine job that I could finish work and forget about it. Previous to that, all my career I'd been self-employed, so you never clock off. So I got a simple job, a simple life, a simple flat, stopped drinking and started meditating in 2012. And one thing led to another. A guy I was working with, a friend, we got on quite well. His wife came from Thailand and he introduced me to Buddhism a little bit. He had some podcasts or some tapes or something, CDs, I'm not sure what they were, in the car, and they were of Ajahn Brahm, a Thai Forest monk in the Ajahn Chah tradition, a disciple of Ajahn Chah, who now is the spiritual leader and head of the Buddhist Society of Western Australia, and he is very famous throughout the world, this English monk who went and studied and was a disciple of Ajahn Chah and has been a monk for all of these many years since and teaches all around the world. So he had some tapes or something of this this monk, and I thought, well, he's a doesn't sound like I imagine a monk to sound, but what he was saying seemed very interesting, and I'd never heard a Dharma talk ever. I didn't know what one was or even what the Dharma was, but what he was saying seemed true and acceptable to me, and there was nothing to believe or imagine or really even think about. It just helped me with my meditation. It was kind of a assistance to what I was already doing. So I listened to a few more of these talks and of course found some other things online. Now he also introduced me and, well, told me about Buddhist monastery where his wife liked to visit occasionally, being Thai. And it just so happened this Buddhist monastery was very near to where I'd been living most of my life, within an hour's drive anyway. And in fact, wherever I'd lived, it had been always within about an hour's drive, but I'd never known of its existence. Now this was the first monastery Ajahn Chah from Thailand, the famous Thai Forest master, renowned throughout the world. He set up this monastery in the south of England, in Sussex, in 1976. And so when I was aged 10, and all of my life it had been there. And this is where Ajahn Sumedho set up this monastery. And there are now 4 in England, but this was the one local to me. He told me about that. And I went along to visit. And there had always been something missing in my meditation, but with the talks I'd heard, from the Dharma talks I'd picked up, I was beginning to put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. When I visited the monastery, Chittaviveka, or Chithurst Buddhist Monastery, in Sussex, England, it really did start to actually fix this jigsaw in place. I came to meet the Sangha, which is something I'd never appreciated even existed in the world, let alone in my country, and especially not on my doorstep virtually. But it was all very weird and wonderful, mystical and strange to me to see men younger than me dressed like this, which I'd never seen before, not even on YouTube. It wasn't something of interest or that I'd ever looked at. I'd been interested as a child, certainly, in more the Shaolin type of monastic living, monks, Shaolin monks, and even in Tibetan Buddhism, what you'd hear about through the news and the Dalai Lama, but knew very little about it. I was interested in martial arts, kung fu, and my own thing was jiu-jitsu, which is a kind of a martial arts derivative from Japan, I think, and Japan and Brazil, it's a bit of a mixture. But that was as far as I knew about Buddhism and even about Asia, nothing at all. But I went to this monastery briefly, and then I went again for a bit longer and spent an evening and struggled a little bit with the puja and the sitting in a formal situation with other people, even for a short while meditating. I felt at that time still very self-conscious, very much, everyone's looking at me, and I wish I'd sat at the back, not the front. I was keen, so I'd sat at the front, and I thought, oh, why did I sit at the front now? I can't see if everyone's staring at me. You probably may be used to this experience, or maybe not, but it was an alien environment I was in. And, but I kept going. There was something kept drawing me back. I'm kind of losing my train of thought a little bit there, I apologise. But yes, I was being drawn back. Ah, yes, I know what I was going to say. Now, what really particularly drew me in was I was still working a little bit then. So Sundays I was free, and I would go there on a Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning actually, and have the meal with them. I hadn't taken the 8 precepts at this stage, but I was learning to understand that they eat only before lunchtime, so if I want to get fed I had to go early. So I went early, had some food, and then what? This was probably the first occasion that this expression came up, then what? Which comes up so often in this practice when you become a monk or start living in monasteries. You're always thinking, now what? What happens now? The answer is nothing, that's it. And it takes some getting used to. So after the meal, then what? I had all afternoon nothing to do. At first I'd get in my car again, go to the nearby town, have a coffee, look around the shops. But after a while I learned to walk around the forest, have a look at the waterfall, enjoy the countryside, and then spend more time in the actual Dharma hall, the temple there, sitting in meditation alone. I know what I was going to say, yes. The group meditation with other people felt a bit strange. I've never been on a meditation retreat. I've never practiced this organised group meditations that many of you have. Goenka retreats and even in monasteries. Now I've subsequently organised, been part of the organisation of them, I've ran them, I've taught at them, and been at them and experienced them from that point of view, but as a new meditator I didn't do that. I practiced alone. At first with guided meditations on podcasts and well, podcasts it was then, and then later in a little bit in the monastery where I was visiting, but primarily alone with my own practice. So that's why that was a little bit unusual to me. But what really got me drawn in to the monastic life was on Sunday afternoons, after you'd spent some time meditating, you would have tea with the lay people and anyone staying there, lay people staying there, and lay people visiting in the very nice kind of what used to be the Dharma hall or reception hall there for people. They'd have some tea, very simple, it would come out, and a monk would come and answer questions. There would be questions and answers with a real monk, and these monks are very senior there. And I found that fascinating. Now, I didn't really ever ask questions, but I found very interesting listening to the questions of lay people and hearing the answers. A little shy I was then, you know, to ask questions, thinking, well, people will think that's a silly question. Of course, no questions are silly. You know that, I know that now. But then I was coming from a very different background of no understanding, real avijja, ignorance, at least to Dharma and the practice of Buddhism. But these afternoons, I found them absolutely thrilling. No, thrilling is the wrong word. Intriguing, enthralling, that's the word I'm looking for, enthralling. They'd go on probably for no more than an hour or so. But I was so enthusiastic about the practice after just hearing these monks answering questions and acting like it was all so natural, something that was so unnatural to me. And time went on until I'd been going quite regularly. I decided I should stay. I heard you could stay there. And I asked, and they said I could come and stay just for a few nights. This is the maximum. So this was the beginning of the process, as I explained it in the last talk. I went and stayed for a few nights, couldn't wait to leave by the Monday morning, because the minute I arrived, what now? What next? Now what happens? Nothing. Evening puja, early in the morning, meal, nothing. Evening puja, early in the morning, meal, nothing, until Monday morning. I was tearing my hair out, you know, no phones, no this and that things for entertainment. And because you'd normally hand these things in, you see, to the office if you have them. But I left on the Monday morning, keen to get my taxi, walking down the road. And at that moment something clicked. No, 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 I want to go back. I realized I was going back out into what I had before I was in there, went in there. And it was then I realized that no, I understand now. That what now, what next is what it's all about. There is nothing. Now, what next? Now I was facing getting the taxi was Monday, Tuesday, going to work, blah, 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 blah. You're all back to the normal again. Getting money, paying for this, paying for that, paying the rent, cleaning the flat, doing all of these things, normal life that wasn't going on in this monastery. Just some duties, that's all. So I got to thinking and thought, well, this is interesting. And I really did start visiting this monastery very regularly then and really studying the Dharma, trying to understand, reading the Majjhima Nikaya at first, the middle-length discourses, the word of the Buddha, that is, his teachings in the suttas, and really getting to grips with understanding what this practice was all about. And it really did start to help with my meditation. If it hadn't, then this really wouldn't have gelled with me, it wouldn't have set. But because my meditation started to improve and fall into place, and the doubts I was having about the results, let's say, of my meditation. You shouldn't look for results in meditation, but you look for change in yourself. I didn't see so much change in myself through my meditation until such a time as I could put the pieces together, fill in the gaps with Buddhism. And that's what was happening. gradually, slowly but surely, until it got to a critical point in about 2014, when I had been practicing then, I suppose, for 3 years, because really, although I said 2012, it kicked off in about 2011, I suppose, so 2 or 3 years anyway, and I felt I wanted to take it to another level. I asked at the monastery, and I said, look, I am keen to stay longer in the monastery. I'm not sure about ordination, and I'm not sure about coming to live here. The reason I wasn't sure about going to live in the monastery in my own country was I didn't feel there was enough of a difference in that, enough separation in that from my lay life. You could literally walk out the gate and an hour's down the road was where I lived and everything I'd known. So I wanted to experience monastic life in another country, and obviously I'd heard all of the stories of Thailand, Ajahn Chah's tradition, Thai Forest Monasteries, and I'd heard about Wat Pa Nana Chat and Wat Pa Pong in northeast Thailand. Wat Pa Nana Chat is the monastery for the international monastery Ajahn Chah set up for Westerners to ordain in. So I said, I want to go there. And they said, are you sure? It's quite tough. I said, yes. So I went there on a trip. Didn't like it, didn't even last a day. Too tough for me. But more so, it was all English speaking and lots of younger people than me. Very enthusiastic, very keen. It was very military. It was very organised, and it wasn't for me. It kind of put me off. It was nothing like the atmosphere as I was experiencing in my home monastery there, Chittaviveka. Nothing at all. But it's a very good place if you want to go for intensive practice and training in monastic life. But for me, still then, with a lot of kilesas, a lot of defilements, you know, greed, hatred, delusion, a lot of self-opinion, a lot of Sakkaya Ditthi, personality view, if you like, a lot of ego, I couldn't bring myself to stick. So I spent the time there just visiting Wat Pa Pong, Ajahn Chah's actual monastery, which was much more my kind of thing, although I wasn't able to stay there because it's just Thai monks then were staying there. And I didn't have sufficient experience either to stay in a Thai Forest Monastery with Thai monks. This is why they set up Wat Pa Nana Chat. So I just visited there daily and went to many other monasteries in that region and travelled around that region. Went out on a little scooter on my own, went to the Mekong River, crossed it to Laos, came back. It was all very beautiful, and continued with my practice. And I did this for a few months and then came back to England. And I thought, well, now, you know, I want to do something, still progress this. I spoke to on a Sunday afternoon after the tea time, I spoke to one monk and said, look, you know, I still have this flat and I have this job. And he said, just get rid of it all, because you're using that as an excuse. You have your flat and your job. The only reason you have the flat is because you have a job, and the only reason you have a job is to pay for the flat. And all you want to do is be here and meditate. And if you're here and meditating, you don't need the flat or the job. Well, I mean, that just rang bells. I thought chimes, in fact. Yes, of course, that makes so much sense. So get rid of the flat, get rid of the job. I'll get rid of the flat first, just in case. So I got rid of the flat, and that's when I moved into the van. No, not quite. I got rid of everything in the flat and reduced the job down to just bare minimum hours. I changed job, in fact, from a 5-day-a-week job to just 2 days a week. I won't go into all of that, the jobs, because they are other stories. I met the Dalai Lama. I did all sorts of wonderful things in some of the jobs I had. But that aside, again, for another time, I reduced my working hours to the absolute bare minimum and took a job which was just minimum wage, and I could earn just enough to keep this van on the road, and I had some savings for my travel to Thailand and back, visas and things like that. I went to the abbot at my monastery and said, look, I'm thinking I want to ordain, because Ajahn told me to get rid of the flat and the job, and I'm going to do that. So I want to ordain and live in a monastery all of the time, but I don't want to live here. I've been to Thailand, I went to Wat Pah Nanachat, and I didn't like it. And the abbot said, we knew you wouldn't like it there. He said, we didn't want you to go there. We said we didn't think it would be right for you, but you knew better. You see what I was saying yesterday? We always think we know best, but I didn't know best at all. He said you should go to where I did go, Wat Marb Jan, not far from here, and this is where the abbot there had lived for 10 years. So my then abbot, Ajahn Karunako, he'd been there for 10 years, and other senior monks in that tradition, they're very senior now, had been there for living for 10 years, by which time I was talking to them, they'd been monks for 20, 30 years, so they were very, very experienced and able to point me in the right direction. And he suggested I went to Wat Marb Jan, near here. So I got on a plane in 2015 and went there with a view to ordaining. And I stayed there for a few months, and that was it, I was going to ordain. But the kilesas, the defilements kept coming in, and oh well, I don't like all the jobs and all the work, and it's very difficult. I was better off at home, practicing alone. The usual arguments, they're just excuses, but they were all coming up. I had no excuses. Then my father got ill, had cancer. A long story short, he did eventually die in 2020, but it was 5 years of this getting better, then okay for a while, and then getting worse again, as these things go, aging, sickness and death. Although my sister very admirably was the most responsible one and was dealing with all of that and helping my father the most, I used it a bit as an excuse, but I did want to be around to support my sister, even just as a brother and a friend, not physically hands-on, because I wasn't very good with that kind of thing, but driving around occasionally, I'd hire a car and give them lifts to hospital and things like that. Now, they could have done without that help. I could have ordained then, but I didn't feel it was appropriate, and to some extent I'd say I used it as an excuse to put it off. But I kept visiting the monastery in Thailand, spending as much time as I could there, and coming back to England, to the monastery in England, and then I got rid of the flat and moved into my van in about 2017, where I lived for 3 years. A tiny little bit of work that had come about from my previous work that I was able to do, earn sufficient money, but it took no time at all. It took time, but it didn't involve me so much. It just involved my presence. So I was able to drive this van to a location, be there, meditate, and then leave. It was unusual, but it was ideal for a meditator. And earn sufficient money just to keep the van on the road and to buy a little bit of food. But by then, living as a monk and on a beach like this, I did already begin to get the support of local people. They'd become accustomed to me living there for so long, after a while that is, and saw I was never going away in the winter, as most people do, don't visit the beach, just some dog walkers, and they'd come and bring me things in the winter when it was very cold, and bring me some food or some water if mine was frozen, and help me out a little, so giving me some kindness and support and sort of dharna, even though I wasn't a monk. But I really was living as a monk. I'd taken the 8 precepts at my monastery in Thailand in 2015 and have ever since been on those 8 precepts. So that's now 8 years that I haven't had anything to eat in the afternoon, and I've always slept on the floor in that time, and longer than that I've been celibate, and certainly longer than that I've had no intoxicants, and refrained from killing and stealing and lying. So there was a little bit of entertainment still, if I could manage to find some internet and some electricity in my van, but very little, because there was rarely any electricity, even if there was internet. So even a mobile phone wouldn't last for long with no electricity. You could run the van, but it wasn't economical or appropriate to do so, and the gases from the exhaust would come into the van. So it was a very solitary existence, living as a monk on a beach for 3 years, but visiting Thailand as often as I could. Probably for a month or so, 3 times a year. And at the end of 2019, or the middle of 2019, on one of my trips to Thailand, I was thinking now is the time to come here and ordain. But first, I'll just check out another Buddhist country. So after a quick visit to England to check on my father and my sister, I went to Cambodia, where I lived on... Cambodia wasn't for me, it was too built up by then, rather disappointing from what I was expecting. But I found a little island off the coast, southern coast of Cambodia, and I went and lived on an island alone, just in a tent on the beach for a month. There were some resorts and a resort on the island, but it was the other side, and I was undisturbed, literally in solitude. Some local people thought I was a monk, so they brought me food. And that was all I needed for 1 month. And that was my first real experience of monastic life, being fed by lay Buddhists. Although I tried to explain I wasn't a monk, I looked like I was bald, I'd shaved my head. When I first went to Wat Marp Jan, just before I first went to the first monastery in Thailand. So I was being looked after by lay Buddhists on this little island for a month, and it gave me a proper taste for monastic living. And I made the decision there and then to ordain. But I'd also, I don't know why, but before I first went to Thailand, I thought I needed to check out, I've missed a whole chapter, haven't I? But I thought I needed, because this is more my biography than the ordination process, but it's an important part of it. But before I went to Thailand, I thought I've only looked at Theravada Buddhism. I need to look at Mahayana, Vajrayana, Tibetan, Zen, whatever else there is. And you can only Google so much, and too much comes up. I need to go to the land of the Buddha, where the Buddha comes from. I'm a great believer in getting down to the lowest common denominator. If you want to know how something works, take it to pieces, break it down and find the insides and put together just what is necessary. So if you need a vehicle to get from A to B, you just need a seat, a steering wheel and 4 wheels. The rest of it's just extras. And I looked at Buddhism like that. So I took it all to pieces and thought, I need to go where the Buddha was born. I need to go to where he was enlightened. I need to go to where he first taught and where he first died. Where he died. He last died. He attained to parinibbana, his final death. I need to visit these places. And when I visit those places, I will experience other schools, other traditions of Buddhism, like Mahayana, Vajrayana, Theravada, and Tibetan, because they all, of course, congregate in these Buddhist holy places, especially in Bodh Gaya. So I went to India in, I suppose it was 2014, and I didn't have long. I only had a month or so, and I wanted to visit all these places. I didn't go on an organised trip. I went on my own, and all I had with me was for a guide, was Ajahn Sucito's Rude Awakening, a book he'd written in 2013. Well, it was published in 2013. His trip was in 2003, and he'd written it in 2003. But it gave me, it might have been published then, I'm not sure exactly. It gave me his walking trip of those holy places that he did over a year or 6 months, I think, his 6 months with his lay person, Upasaka, John, the name, anyway, it doesn't matter. This is the only book I could find. There was a point of reference at the time. Again, this is another whole story, my trip to India, my pilgrimage, that is for another talk. But I went there, and I got buses, I got trains to these different places, and I managed to spend about a week in each place. I managed to spend 10 days in Bodh Gaya, where I spent all of the time meditating under the Bodhi tree where the Buddha was enlightened. I tried to meditate for 108 hours, but only managed about 90 because they close in the evening, and they don't open until a certain time in the morning, and you do have to go off and get something to eat. So the most I could get in was about 90 hours in 10 days, but nothing else to do, just meditate under the tree, thinking I'd become enlightened. But I didn't become enlightened. But what I did become enlightened to was all of the other traditions passing me all day long, as I wasn't really meditating, just watching all of them going past, actually that way. But talking to monks of other traditions, I also was staying in monasteries in these places of other traditions. I stayed in a Tibetan monastery, I stayed in wherever I could get a room, really, or anywhere to stay, I'd stay in these different monasteries. When I went to Sarnath, in the place where the Buddha first taught, which is near Varanasi, on the river Ganges there, about some distance, 800 or 900 kilometers from Bodh Gaya. When I was in Sarnath, I stayed at the Mahabodhi Society there in Sarnath, and I got to know a monk there. Now he was of the Theravada tradition, and during this time there, I was able to draw the conclusion that by sheer fortune I had fallen into the correct tradition for me. Theravada, way of the elders, this means, really is close to, back to that lowest common denominator thing again, breaking it down into the simplest form, back to the teachings of the Buddha as they were. This is what I learned on this trip to India. So I need to pick the pace up a little, because I think it's getting dark, and that means I'm going to run out of time. Not run out of time. The phone doesn't like making videos longer than about 40-50 minutes. Anyway, it just reinforced that what I was doing was the correct thing, and I'd made the decision to ordain. So after my visit to Cambodia, and having seen Buddhist practice in a different country, a Buddhist country, other than the Buddhist country of Thailand, I thought, actually, I'm going to ordain in India. Now, I'm not sure exactly why, but because of my experience there previously, I thought if I ordain where the Buddha invented this whole thing, then it has to be a good idea. I'm not sure, but it really did feel right. So this is a kind of determination that I'd made. And as it happened, I had no choice about this anyway, because I got back to England, and this, although I didn't believe any of it at the time, because I was living in my van on the beach and had no TV or anything to know much about what was going on, this pandemic had arrived, and I wasn't going anywhere, it seemed, ever again. I wasn't even allowed to go to the shops. The police came along, the local authorities came along, and they said, hey, you can't live here, you've got to be in your house, use the lockdown. I said, well, lock me in here, because this is where I live. Which they agreed to. They thought it was unusual, but they said, well, you cannot leave this van. You cannot go from this place in the van, no driving off. I said, don't worry about it, I wasn't planning to. And I stayed then in this van for 6 months on this beach in a lockdown, until, to cut a long story short again, such a time I could get on a plane and go to Bangalore. So this monastery, in my monastery, still my monastery, in Bangalore, the Mahabodhi Society, not in Bodh Gaya, but in Bangalore, South India, where I ordained, took Pabbaja, or Anagarika ordination, and then Pabbaja a bit later on. Became a monk in 2020. I became Bhante Dhammarakkhita, not Bhikkhu then, Bhante Dhammarakkhita. I then subsequently, having spent then a year as a monk with them, then my first Vasa there, I wasn't counting as a Vasa because I wasn't a Bhikkhu, I hadn't taken Upasampada, but my first rains time we still weren't allowed to go anywhere else, there in Bangalore, and my second actually, but I was ordained. I was able to go and visit some other places in South India, to go on little tudongs, as long as I kept returning to the monastery for training and this and that. But after a year, I was allowed and it was all arranged that I could take Upasampada, higher ordination, Bhikkhu ordination, which is what I did. And I took Bhikkhu ordination with 2 other monks, a whole lot of other monks from the Mahabodhi Society, but they can only ordain 3 at a time at the very most. So my 3 brothers there, we ordained at the same time and became bhikkhus, and that was how I became a Buddhist monk. I think I've missed a whole bit of something out there, but I'm wary of the time. This phone just kind of overheats and will cut me off anyway. If I don't cut myself off, that's what happens. And then also it has some problems with its uploading if you allow it to do that. But that aside, I hope that explains a little bit about how my experience of this ordination process has been. It's had its ups and its downs, but all of it, with this underlying continual practice, is training, is teaching, is developing patient endurance, we call kanti in the Pali word. You're perfecting your parami, these 10 qualities of generosity, of morality, and ultimately of equanimity, this unreactiveness, or at least wise reactiveness to all of the vicissitudes of life in lay life, becoming a calmer and better person, but then able to go into any monastic environment. And I joined a very busy, I chose to ordain, one reason I chose not to ordain in Thailand is because the monastery there is a very busy monastery, a lot of monks, including quite a lot of foreign monks. So a very busy monastery has a lot of duties, a lot of work. Which is why I went to Cambodia looking for another monastery. But then I decided to ordain in the monastery in India, which was even busier than where I'd come from, by chance. There were 108 monks for the Vassa staying there, living there, including some, 70-odd Samaneras, junior monks, because it was also a school. And there I was also required to teach in the classroom, teach English for at least a year when I was a Samanera. And 5 days a week as a school teacher, which was very alien to me. And I wasn't very good at it. I just talked like this. But this was all part of the training, and made them aware of what I was like and determine whether I was suitable or not for Bhikkhu ordination. Because you need to be prepared, you need to be ready. And only when I was ready did they say, yep, you can join the next group of monks that you can join them to take this Upasampada, higher ordination. And I was very privileged and fortunate to have that take place in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha became enlightened. And then in the beginning of this year, for visa reasons really only, I spent the last Vassa in a vihara, which is a little monastery where a monk can live alone, in the middle of nowhere, but not too far from Bangalore, about a couple of hours, 70 kilometres, but that's a couple of hours driving that part of India, a long time for just 70 kilometres, I know, but it takes a long time, in order that I could go back for my Uposatha nights for the Patimokkha recitation. But I spent the last Vassa 3-month period in Tumkur, and that's where I began making these videos. From there on after, you can watch videos more or less every day about what I've done since. It's all on there, so you can see that on this channel. And there is a description under every video, which is exactly the same, because I'm too lazy to write another one, of that kind of what happened, that biography, at least in very short form. But I will continue to add the bits that I've left out in future talks and tell you some of those stories also. So if you have a look back, you'll see some of those experiences and hear about them also. For now, I think I should leave it there. Thank you for watching. If there's something useful in there, please share it. Today's talk was just really a matter of by request. People have asked this so many times. I thought it was time I ought to just spend a little time talking about my experience of ordination and how I came to be here. Yes, so how I came to be here in January of this year, so 6 months ago, for visa reasons, I had to leave India. I still had 6 months left on my visa. I had a year visa. So I had to leave the country and return. I thought, well, I'll stay here for a couple of weeks, and I'm still here, a bit like when I moved into that van on the beach. So maybe 3 years' time I'll still be here on this beach. It's quite probable. But I'll visit India as regularly as I can in due course after this next Vasa period coming up, because I will be here for that 3 months. All things being equal, assuming I'm still wanted and invited to do so. So that's how I came to be here. And as already a bhikkhu, although not ordained in the Thai Forest tradition here in Thailand, they were able to, I was living here with them for a little while, for some, 3 months, before they, they get to know you very well. They know that your training is from, my training is from the monastery just up the road, an Ajahn Chah Thai Forest Tradition Monastery. So I know the core what, the bylaws, if you like, of the monastery, and the Vinaya, and the practice. And they were sufficiently okay with that and my conduct, that they were able to get me a monk's visa in order that I can stay here without this visa problem in the future that I was having in India quite consistently. So there we are. Here I am. Here it is, here and now. But all along during this time, from back when I first took on the 8 precepts, 12 or so years ago now, getting on nearly 12 years ago, I've always been here. It's always been now. Wherever I've been in the world, it's been here and now. And through meditation, I've come slowly and gradually more and more to understand what that actually means. And also understanding what it means to know and let go. Not just recite these catchy phrases, experience it for ourselves and really know and let go. Thank you. Or Anumodana. Sukhi Hotu. That means be happy. Be happy and stay well.